Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are, my friends. My name's Alex, and I'm here to teach about Gdevelop multiplayer. Now, you're going to have to forgive me as my voice is completely shot. I will do my best to sound well and instruct you. Um, so yeah, forgive me for any sort of rough voice today. Now, I want to start covering how to make multiplayer from blah, 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 blah. How to make multiplayer using the Rage Jump multiplayer template made by Gdevelop and particularly made by HelperWesleys. So Wesley, shout out to you, my good guy. Um, and I wanted to do that from the ground up. Now, currently, I don't have the assets in the link, which actually I should have done before I got started, but that's okay. In the edited video content, there will be a link down to the assets used in this video. But in the meantime, in that way, well, actually, in that way, so people can, if you would like to, you can follow along using those assets in the edit. Yo, what's going on, Bob? Bob the Hob. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. But yeah, we're going to be reviewing through how to use these templates to learn and how simple multiplayer actually is to create in Gdevelop, at least when you're talking about simple terms, right? And to show off what we're going to be doing today, let me go ahead and switch our screen over and launch this project. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this, and then I'll move us over to the main screen. All right. So this is the multiplayer jump game that I was talking about. All we have to do is click join lobby, and it automatically loads us in to via our Gdevelop account. Now, if you don't already have a Gdevelop account, but if you're not logged in, it'll do that pop-up. You guys didn't see the actual pop-up. It moved over to my other screen, but asked me to log in. And so player accounts are already managed through Gdevelop. You don't have to do anything fancy. It's very straightforward. So all we have to do is create a lobby. Go ahead and create that. Our friends could join. And now in the new Gdevelop, you can actually have people join you mid-match if you add the program, or if you program it, rather. But I won't be covering that in this video, but it is something I intend to cover in a more extensive video. But this really is about how you can use these templates from the ground up to learn about all these mechanics and how to use Gdevelop, but also if you follow along in the final edit, you'll be able to feel what it's like to develop this with your own hands. And surprisingly, it doesn't take all that many lines of events. So I'm looking forward to us tackling this, but here, let's get into the game. I'll be quiet here for a moment once we get the game started up. And here, it's a very simple mechanic where we have an arrow bouncing back and forth for our player. And we have to hold the space key to jump. And as we do so, it adds force and then bounces us around. And it's physics-based, so we'll cover some of that content today. And yeah, so that's what it looks like. I suppose I had disabled my desktop audio, so here's what it sounds like with sound. Or maybe not, as apparently I forgot to set the audio line. Let's do that real quick. My bad. We'll put this through where are my headphones? There we are. All right, let's try this again. A little bit of sound effects going on here, just some bumping and bouncing. Hey, what's going on, Riley? Thanks for joining us. But the object of this game is to collect all the apples, and if I was better at this mechanic, ow. I might actually get somewhere, but I'm going to get nowhere because this is just not something that I'm good at. But here we go. Watch me fail. I got to watch out for these spikes and as you can see, I'm getting pushed around by some of these objects. So this is the kind of rage-based jumping mechanic, and it is multiplayer. So if we had a couple other people, we'd be able to have them join us in this match, and we'd be racing against each other to get to the end. And also, it has a chat system. Hello. Oh, that's not the right button. Hello. And we can see that it's updated there. I like this game. All right. So there it is. So we have an active chat system, and our game is, well, here it is, right? So how do we start digesting this? Well, on a different canvas, I have the project open. You can get this project simply and for free by going to the home page into build and then scrolling over until you see the rage jump multiplayer code. Now you could also digest the arrow fight. This is a bit more advanced, and I do plan on covering this a little bit later, but I want to start here with that rage jump. And you could just import it and tinker around with it. Now I have it open on a different screen here. And when you get the project, it will load you into something like this. And you can see that we have our scene objects. We can expand this and go to the game scene so we can see where all that juicy code is. Here's what the layout looks like. I'll turn off the grid here so you guys can see it just a little bit better. And then here we are in the events, and this is where everything happens. Now, this looks like madness. I know, but Alex, how? What do we do? There's a lot going on here, and I don't understand it. That's okay. That's what I'm here for. We're going to digest this bit by bit until we can create this from the ground up, and I'll be explaining each step as we go along here. So in the future, you'll be able to follow along in this tutorial and have all the assets you need. So if you're watching this in real time, I apologize. But yeah, for all of you watching later on, this is for you. So let's kind of get started here. Where do we begin in a multiplayer game? How do we get it to actually start functioning, right? Well, I want to, in this case, I want to break it down into starting with my scenes. I know in my game, I want a menu for players to join the game, and I want the actual game scene. Now, in this project, later on, I'll be expanding and diverging from the actual template so I can show you how to load in other game scenes and things like that. But for now, we're going to keep it exactly like the template has it. So we have a lobby that we begin with. So we're going to just go ahead and press F2 on our keyboard here to select to rename the scene. You can also just go to rename here. We're going to call this lobby. And it's going to close your window. You just have to open it back up because after it gets renamed, it shuts down like that. And then I'm going to add another one, and we're going to call this game scene. And game scene is where we're going to host all of our game code and data. And later on, we'll be building our levels and external layouts and loading those into our game scene rather than creating multiple scenes for different levels. That's not that's really not how Gdevelop works. A scene is a combination of an external event sheet and an external layout combined into one in rough terms. And in that way, they're kind of exclusive. They hold their own variables, they hold their own objects, like scene objects, and they don't transfer between each other. So if we use an external layout to create things like visual differences in levels, we can keep all of our game code in one place, but then organize our maps using a layout system. And it's just I think that for games that have changing levels and a lot of code in common, we want to do that this way rather than duplicating this game scene, adding additional repeats of the same lines of code, and it gets messy really quickly. So we don't want to do that. So I'm going to jump ahead now to the lobby scene. Now, the lobby scene is going to require a extension for us to use a button state extension, which what that allows us to do is essentially just create buttons really quickly and give the logic for buttons to Gdevelop so we can use it in our event sheets. And so we're going to start by adding that extension. I don't need Shake 3D. I don't know why that's in there. We're going to do button states. Button states. There we go. We're going to take the button states and effect extension. We're going to load that into our game. And for now, that'll be it. We're going to come back to the extensions and add them as we need them. I want to start in the lobby of all places because it's easier to break down your game into these smaller segments, these scenes that you know you're going to need. And really, it's the backbone of multiplayer. I know a lot of you are probably really interested to just jump right into the programming of your game, but we can kind of lay down some early groundwork right now to get our game scene prepared, and also to load in our all of our assets and everything. So here, let's see. Here we go. I want to make sure that I get what we need here added properly. Well, okay, we're gonna start very simply. Hey, what's up, Mella? We're gonna jump right into adding some text to our game. Our game needs a title, right? Our game needs a title. Well, luckily, the asset pack comes with a title, so we don't have to necessarily add, right? Add something to like we don't have to create our own text or anything. We've already made this in another program. Well, somebody else did. Wesley did. And we're going to add it to our project. So we're just going to add a sprite, and I'll name this one title for the title screen, right? We're going to go ahead and import from images. And I have this opened up currently. You're not going to really be able to see all the assets right now because they're in list mode. I could probably move them over to icons. There we are. But we're going to reach out and grab the title button. So that it should be right here. There we are. We're going to load that in. And we don't really need to name it anything. You could if you want to. You could call it like rage jump animation or something, but it's not required. We're going to go ahead and add that title into the game scene. Beautiful. And for now, we're just going to kind of put it as close to the middle as possible. We can adjust it in code later if we want, or if we're just comfortable with where it is, we can just leave it right there and move that over a little bit. I'm actually going to turn on the grid again so we can kind of play around with this. The grid is set to 32 by 32. And you'll see here on 32 by 32, we're going to get this line where a square is a little bit like every tile is at the end is just a little bit longer than the game scene. If you want that to be a perfect match, I want to say that it's 16 by 16 to fit it all in the grid. There we go. And that way, if you are working in a tile set or something like that, you can kind of readjust the grid to make it perfect. We're going to kind of change the size a little bit because I stretched it earlier, and we're going to leave it right there. The next thing I want to add is a text object. I'm just kind of building this from the top down. You don't have to do this in any particular order, but this is the way that I wanted to do it. And we're going to start by loading in our font. Going to go ahead and just go back to our game. We're going to look for the Cantora 1 regular. Cantora 1 regular. .ttf. And where is that? Regular. There it is. Oh, there are two of them. Hold on. Is my dyslexia getting the better of me, or are these both the same name? How is that possible? No. Why? Oh, they're different file types. There we go. That's why I understand now. That took me a second. All right. So we're just going to add the... Oh, thanks. I am a little sick right now. So my voice is a little bit more raspy, but you know. We are going to add the... we're going to call this object, now that my brain's focused back on what I'm doing here. Let's call this one subtitle. This is going to be the subtitle of your game, right? Like we're going to let them know what we want them to do here. We're going to tell them, we're going to set this to 30 actually. We're going to set our font color to white, and we'll fix this in a moment. We're going to center it, and we're going to say a simple game about collecting apples. We don't need any outlines or shadows. I'm gonna hit OK. And I want to change our background to black to match the template. So all we're gonna do is drag it all the way down here, or select black down here. And now our background scene is completely black. And now we can add that subtitle in, and because it's white, we'll be able to see it nice and contrasted on that background. So far, no code or anything. That's great. The rest of this is just sort of design, right? We're going to start building all of the pieces to get us in the game. And we'll be coming back and polishing sections of this, but I want us to get us started with at least having the first element necessary for joining a game inside of Gdevelop, or getting inside of a multiplayer game. So to start this process, we want to add a button to our game. There's a lot of ways to do this, but the easiest way is to add a new object to your game scene. Scroll down to the panel sprite button. Go ahead and click that, and we have access to a bunch of different buttons here. Now, I'm going to select probably a different one than the template, just so we have a button here, or a different button choice, but you can use whatever you'd like. Let's do this blue button. I like this. Now it's added a blue button with shadow to our game scene. Now the original one has a brown button with shadow, I do believe, but we're going to be using this blue shadow. What this does, if we drag it to our game scene, we'll add that button into the entire, like it'll add a button that has function to your game scene. And if we go over to our project manager, there we go. I almost, like, my brain is not working today. I'm sorry, again, I'm a little sick, so bear with me. When we go to our project manager up here in the top left, we can see that an extension has been added to our game that I didn't add. Well, Gdevelop has some pretty cool features built into the backend where if you add an object from like the object list and it requires an extension, it'll pull it into your game for you. So you don't have to go find it. It's pretty great. Now we can pair this with some early code. We're going to actually go into our object here by double clicking on it. And once we're inside of it, we can kind of play around with some of the settings. I don't want to do too much here. Personally, actually, all I want to do is adjust the size. And let's add some text here. We're going to say join lobby. We can stretch our button out here until it fits. And if you hold shift, you can scale it all at once. So you don't have to drag it around. You can, it'll scale appropriately. And we're going to realign this sort of to the center of our canvas as well. All right, great. We have the beginnings of our game. This is what's required for us to be able to get into our game, at least in terms of some sort of early structure. Now, I guess we didn't need the title or subtitle. We just need the button, really. But here we go. So from that button, using the button state machine, we can actually apply logic to when we click on this, rather than there is a man, my brain is not working. Alex, come on, let's try that again. Let me let me try that one more time. Hold on here. Back to my lobby. Here we go. All right, we're gonna do that all over again. So once we've added these basic elements to our game scene, we now have a couple objects that we can interact with, because these are object instances that we've added to our canvas, which means now they're accessible in our code. That's what I was trying to say. And now that we have it all a rudimentary layout, we can start applying the first degree of logic to our game. And this is where it takes one line of code to open up the game lobby menu. One line of code. You guys ready for this? It's going to blow your mind. No, it's quite simple. We select on the condition. And now, again, to reinforce this with everyone, a condition begins sort of with an if statement. If this, our action is do that. If this, do that. Okay? So if our button, and now we have a button panel sprite that has some options here, we can also expand that by using our button state machine by applying it to it. But right now we're just going to use the button panel sprite. So we're going to say is clicked. So if the panel sprite is clicked, right? Now we can open our actions. So if that happens, then let's do this. We're going to open the game lobbies. That's it. So with this one line of code in our event sheet, Gdevelop will automatically open. Let's preview this. If I click join lobby, if I'm logged in, it'll automatically use my user account from Gdevelop to allow me to join games. And each game has its own lobby system. So you're not going to get cross-game lobbies using this mechanic. It's specifically designed to keep you within the scope of your title. Now, if we click join, it'll load us into the actual lobby, and we can start the game. We can ready up or unready up, so you can let the host know if you're ready to go or not. And when you join a lobby, you'll start with not ready. You'll actually have to click ready unless you are the host of the game. Now, if I click start game, it's going to try to launch, but nothing's going on. We're kind of stuck here. In fact, it brought me back to the main menu. Well, that's because we need one more line of code to get us into our game. Let's connect our players together, but where do we send them when they're ready? Well, it's a pretty quick call. We actually just open up the conditions. We type lobby, and we look for lobby game has started. So once the lobby says go to all the players, we want to change, oh my goodness, change the scene to our game scene. Now what that means is essentially when we click the button, it'll open the game lobby. Once we hit ready up and everybody's ready, it'll send a signal to the client, which is the game that you, the user playing on the client, to join or to change the game scene and enter the game state of your project. There's a lot of words, but I'll break it down little by little. There's a question here. Let me look at this. If you want, can you use the tween to move or squish the character, or in this case, the title? Yeah, you can. Yeah. So, and I'll cover that here in just a little bit, but it's that's pretty straightforward as well. Excuse me. Sorry, my throat is a little dry here, so I'm taking a sip of water. Now, to make all of this work, I want to add a little bit, well, not to make it all work, sorry. To finish up a little bit of flair here on the title screen before we move on, I want to effectively create a dynamic camera that will put a texture on the background for us so we don't have to stretch it over the camera. So just add a little bit of polish here before we move on to the next step. I'm just kind of rearranging some things so it doesn't look so off-centered. Now, I could use programming to center these, and I think you should if you want them all to be in line for the user's screen width and height. But yeah, I'm pretty fine with this. Anyways, so we're going to add another object. We're going to add a sprite object. Actually, my apologies, not a sprite object. It's a tiled sprite. So we're going to go to the tiled sprite. And what this does is repeat a texture over and over. And we're going to call this one background without stretching it. Over and over without stretching it. We're going to select an image. And we're going to go find the background or green tab. We're going to go to actual green. I think it looks like there's two assets in there. One of them we won't need. So just get green or green2.png. That's totally fine. We're going to upload this to the game scene. Now, I'm going to move this beyond the camera. So if you see this white little outline, this is your game camera in terms of what the player gets to see. And we can move this around to be able to look at different things or, to follow your player or whatever you want. Now, a layer can have multiple cameras, but also we can simply overlay different game layers as well on top of these cameras. So there's multiple cameras per layer, and there's multiple layers that have their own cameras. So we can add a background to our game, for example. We kind of show you this in real time. And I'm going to go ahead and resize this bad boy. We're going to give it it's going to be a little bit off on the height and width. We're going to set this one to 384 by 128. And, sorry, no, that's not right. My brain. It's 608. Followed by 480. I don't know what's going on there. My brain today. And I want to do let's see. 16, 12. Yeah, we're going to follow the tutorial to the letter. You could probably, we'll do 608 because that'll be per square. That'll work. So we're just going to move this over here. It doesn't really matter where you put it because we're going to use some code logic to center the camera on this and apply it to the background here. So we're actually going to move the camera. But for us to be able to do that, we need to add another layer. And I'm going to move it underneath the base layer, and we're going to call this background. So we have a background layer and a base layer. All of our game, like all the interactables, are going to be on the base layer. And then we're just going to change this one by clicking on it and going to background. This sends it to the other layer. Now we can control our cameras a little bit differently from each other. So we have multiple layers of camera going on. I'm going to add an event, and we're going to add the condition beginning of the scene. All right. So at the beginning of the scene, we want to set up our variables. And for organization purposes in this demo, I'm going to add a comment and move it just underneath here to visually split what we're working on for now. I'll probably add, we'll do join lobby as the definition of what's going on here. I'll copy and paste this, move it down here, and we'll do some, I'm just I know it's coming, so I'm going to go ahead and preemptively write what I know. But here we go. We have a little bit of coding structure, and I'm going to drop in and use children to organize this so you can see it step by step. So you could run the action here, a at the beginning of the scene variable in Gdevelop does not require a trigger once. This is a trigger once on its own. So for each player who joins the scene, whenever someone loads in this, it'll trigger. If we reloaded the scene, it would trigger again. But every time we enter this state. I don't know if you guys can hear that. My dog is drinking water very loudly. All right. So what we're going to do now is add a action that lets us zoom our camera into that background. We're going to kind of like focus in on it. So we're going to type center. And what? Why is all my animals deciding to be loud right now? Can we not do this, guys? Hello? Anyways, we're going to center the camera on the object, and we're going to center on the background. Now, we're going to change this to the background layer because it needs to target a specific camera layer. And so we're going to target the background, right? And then the default camera is 0, so we don't actually have to put anything in here. But if you wanted to, you could type 0 just to be thorough. And so here we go. Now, when we press play, at the beginning of the scene, it'll center our game texture. Because it's a repeating tile, we can see that it repeats like this, which is great, without stretching and dysmorphing the background, but it's way small. What the heck? Well, we could make it the same size as the screen, but also you can simply just zoom in on it if you'd like to. And we can control camera zooms at different levels from each other. So if we go to our action and we type zoom, we can get the camera zoom. We're going to set this to a 2x zoom in this example. And then we're going to leave it at, we're going to zoom in on the background. And then we're going to leave the camera slot to 0. So I can show you that that works. I actually want to zoom the camera in before we center on the background, just to make sure that this visually doesn't cause some sort of like screen tearing. Because if we did the center the camera first, the user, if they have a fast enough computer, might actually see the resize happen. So let's zoom in first and then center it. And we have a little bit of overlay on each side, but that's totally fine because we're going to add some texture around it. But there we go. We've now moved an object that was off our camera into our camera. That's pretty cool. Now, we're not going to add any fancy animations to the front end yet. I just wanted to simply show you that we can make a nice little menu for our game pretty rapidly. But now is the real moment. We want to start getting into the meat of our game before we do any more polish. So now that we've completed our first task of actually drafting the lobby menu, we want to join our game just to make sure it works. I'm ready, so I'm going to load in. And as you can see here, it's loaded me in through the preview and directly into the new game scene, which is blank. And that's how you change game scenes, just like that. So with 2 lines of code and already being logged into Gdevelop, you have everything you need to get started making a multiplayer game right now. Let's get to the meat of this. Let's go to our game scene, and we're going to need to start creating a few objects to build up upon what's going to be this final project, the jumping rage mechanics. Let's see here. Where do I want to begin? I think that for most people, when you're developing this is actually a big question we get, right? Where do we start in making our game? Like, okay, I see all this template material. Like, if I bring the game scene over from this example and we're looking at it, there's a lot going on here. And every object that we have in our game scene might have its own behaviors that we need to pay attention to. Like, what do we add? What events and in what order? Why? It can be hard to digest all that information. So instead of doing that, I want to create each object with you, and we'll build upon it as we build through this template. And by the end, you'll have an exact replica of the template, without that you made, but it's going to be exactly the same as the one that's in the asset store, and you'll understand how each part works. So here we are with fundamentally the most important part of our game, our player. We're going to start by adding a new object to the game scene. We're going to go to sprite, and inside of the sprite name, we're going to type player object. Another way that I might write this, if it was me, for my templates, I generally do object underscore player, but that's a naming convention that I brought over from years of experience in other platforms. So we're going to follow the actual template here as it is, as closely as possible. And so we're going to use player object. And we need to start by importing in animation. I always like to start with our idle animation. A lot of these sprites that are in this template, and I believe all of the sprites that are in this template, you can simply pull from the asset store. I'm not sure exactly what all of them are called, but if I type frog, maybe I'll find it. And here we are. Actually, there's a ninja frog here, and this is the character we're going to be using. You could simply import the character this way, but using the asset uploader or being able to simply just add a file from our device, we're going to be using the assets that are already prepared right here. Makes it pretty simple. We can type idle in the top of our search bar, and it will pull up all of the idols for this sprite. Unfortunately, they're not in any particular order that I can identify, so that's not going to work. I lied. We're going to go back into idle, and hope that idle 12 through 21 is the actual idle sprite. Oh, we have more idle. It's been duplicated. I see. There was probably a double upload. Okay, that's fine. We'll be able to take idle 1 through 11. Go ahead and add that to our game scene. And now if we press preview, we'll have our idle animation. Now we want to loop this to make sure that our player is constantly going through that idle animation. And I want this to go a little bit faster for what we're doing here. So we're going to change that to 0.05 and we'll preview it again. And that's nice and fluid. Thankfully, our game doesn't have too many sprites. We can add another animation. We're going to add the hit animation, and we're also going to add the jump animation. And we also need the fall animation. Now that I've got them all there, we can simply go back, click on the drop-down arrow, click on Files from your device, and we'll scroll down until we get to our hit. We're going to start with right here with hit 2 and moving all the way to hit 7. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, if we want to, when we add these files in, if I was to preview this now, we have our 1 hit animation. It goes pretty quick. But there's something you can do. If you don't quite like how fast or slow something's going, we can add more frames to it by just duplicating frames we already have in our framework. And so we can right click on this and click duplicate. I like that, but I want maybe a little bit more variety in our hit. So I'm going to take this end piece, we're going to duplicate it again and move it over so that we have a frame before the character gets stretched back down, and we're going to extend this one as well. So we have the 2 hit whites frames, the hit 7, and then we're duplicating the hit here. And now I understand why there was multiple assets with hit in it. It's because during the creation of the sprite assets, or during the creation of this template, they were duplicated and able to extend some of the animation times. And we could do the same thing with this animation. If we doubled up on all the frames, or um, we can make it longer and smoother, and more frames, more animation. I'll leave it up to you how you organize these. You don't have to if you don't want to. But if you want to add just a little bit more juice maybe to that sprite and give it just a little bit more time, we're going to also make sure that we're not going to loop it, but I want to see you that you could watch it in loop basically if you wanted to. Yeah, I think that stretching and squashing is probably good enough. So we're going to take that back off loop because we only want this to happen once if the player's hit. We're going to add a sprite from this again. We're just going to take the jump sprite. And we're also going to take the fall sprite. I'm going to hit apply. Yeah, we're going to go ahead. Yeah, sorry. I had to get a drink of water there. We're going to hit apply. And then we're going to add some points to our character. Now, points are positions in our sprite that can be used to do things like point checkers or collision checks, or we can reposition and our character and put a point above its head so that we can add text, like a player's name, above their head. So we're actually going to start by integrating these points. Now, I personally prefer putting the origin of my character at the bottom of the feet. And that way, whenever I'm dealing with my character, it's being drawn from the origin point upwards. Now, mostly it'll start up here on the top left. It doesn't really matter. You could put it in the middle if you want. The collision box is what's going to decide where your player, where the framing of your player is. So it's kind of up to you, but I just like putting it at the bottom. I do know that the template puts it at exactly the same place as the eye. So I guess to keep it in template theme, we'll just keep it there, but I would probably put it down here personally. We're going to add in a ground check, and this will be ground check and then ground check 2. Whoa, that is not how we spell ground. Ground check 2. We're going to end up putting these ground checks to the left and right of the player underneath their feet. So when we're using the physics, we can decide when we touch a platform and sort of like how to tell if we're supposed to slide off the platform or fall straight down, things like that. And we're also going to add another point called name point. We haven't added any locations yet, but these are the 3 points we're going to need. I'm going to follow the template here, and it's going to be 10 at 38. And that'll put it, if you look, it'll go 10 over and 38 down. So it's like right underneath the back foot. And we're going to do the same thing right here. And the value for that is 23 and 38 as well. So we have left and right side, basically. And then the name point, we're going to go, because the sprite is 32 by 32, we're going to go to the middle of 16. And we're going to put it above the player's head, a little bit further outside of the square to give us a little bit of breathing room in our sprite. And that name point will be at just right there. It'll give us a nice little stretch when we're able to put our player name in there. So that's perfect. There's a bunch of different ways where you can spawn a player name, but definitely using a player object that self-governs itself and keeps its points. Let's see. Well, I'm trying to think here because I have you guys on live stream. I'm trying to give you guys extra information than what will be in the actual tutorial. I'll be redoing the voiceover entirely for that, but I'll be using the clips from here. But I was thinking about what best adds value to you guys in all of this. And so it's going to be a little bit longer. But anyways, in Gdevelop, every object is self-governing. So if an object has variables, like a player object, we're going to be making a multiplayer game that has multiple players. How do we differentiate them from themselves, and how does Gdevelop do that? Well, every time we add an object to the game scene, it becomes an instance of an object. We can have multiple instances, and if an object is self-governing or an instance is self-governing, it means that it keeps track of its own data on its own already. So there's actually not a whole lot we have to do to set up the player except for building the base mechanics. And so to do that, we're going to go into our player's behaviors, and we have to start adding some of the fundamentals to our game. Well, we know that this is going to be a bouncing, rage-inducing sort of game, and excuse me, and also a multiplayer object, which means we need to start our project here with the multiplayer extension. So we can go multiplayer, and we'll see that there's a multiplayer object. We're going to add that to the game scene, and the current player owning the object would be the host of the game. And that's just for convenience sake, so that every object that's made is first assigned to the host and then assigned to a player as they're connecting. We're going to add another behavior, and we're going to add physics 2D. Right here, physics engine. We're going to make it so that our player can sleep, and we're going to fix the rotation so that the player doesn't go rotating in circles. If you want your character to bounce around, go upside down, and all of that, please have at it. You can definitely do that here. We're not going to do that. But we want instead of a box shape. Hey, Henry, no problem. So instead of adding a box shape for our collider in our physics, we're actually going to use a circle. And this will allow us to roll off of platforms in a physical sense, like in physics. But even though our character is a flat square spray. But we have to kind of build the radius of the circle, and we're going to do it to half the body size of the player, which is 16. And we're not going to apply any offsets. We're going to leave the gravity as it is, and we're going to add just a little bit more friction to make sure our player, the sliding of our player feels right. And we're going to improve the resistance as well. This way that the character can, we're adding a little bit more weight dynamics to our player. You can play around with these. There's no real right or wrong answer here. I want you to make sure that you get an opportunity to make the game that feels right to you. So feel free to play this. I would definitely leave gravity scale at a 1. You might want to change gravity, incrementally later on in your game or something. Maybe there's power-ups or things that change it. But honestly, I feel like adjusting your density or something else would be a better starting point to give players a more floaty feel. Offsetting this from everybody else can add some different mechanics and different feel, but there's a lot of ways to go about using this part. So don't feel like there's a particular right way. Just tinker around until the game feels right. We're going to turn off layer 1. And the reason is we can apply it to 1, but think of this like layers like a camera. In this case, in physics, each player is going to need their own layer so that they don't collide with each other on that layer. And then at the same time, objects like tile sets will need a layer as well to make sure that we can collide with those things while also not colliding with the players. So there's a little bit going on here, but we're going to actually add the code for this in a minute to make sure that each player who's connecting gets their own layer. All right, we are going to leave on mask 1 though. Now, there's one more thing that I want to do to add polish to our character and our movement in our game, but it requires adding another extension, and that's going to be the smooth camera extension. We'll go down to the extensions, delete this and go smooth, select the smooth camera, and install that to the project. Now that it's there, this one actually has to be applied directly to an object, and you only want to apply it to one because your client, your screen will want to follow that one character. If you add this to more things, it's going to freak out the system and it won't know what to look at. So we're going to add smooth camera, smooth. And let's see, we're going to go smooth camera. We're going to leave all of this exactly the same. So right now, if I was to press play in our game and we could move our character, let's say left and right, the camera would smoothly sort of allow the player to move and then it'll trail behind it. We'll see a little bit more of this later on when we actually get into the moving mechanics, but we can leave that there. And you don't need to change anything here inside of the advanced properties. This is just kind of extra, but we don't need that. We're going to hit apply, and now we're back in our game scene. All right. So that's basically it for our player. Our player object, if we added them now, would be a physics item, and we could start moving it around if we had we would program the actual movement. But to make this kind of flow better in this tutorial, I'm going to add the indicator now, which is that arrow that bounces left and right in this template, so that way you can see which way you're going before it before you let go of your spacebar and whatnot. So to do that, we're just going to add a sprite object, right? And this is pretty straightforward. It's just a simple sprite. We're going to name it indicator arrow. Perfect. We're going to import an image, and we're going to import the texture. Let's go back to extra large icons. So you guys, we'll go large icons. There we go. And we're going to be looking for the arrow icon once right here. Perfect. We hit apply there. Add it to our project. And then we're going to add a name here, just because I think that naming your animations is a good idea. And they also do it in the template. So we're going to name it jump arrow. And that way we don't have to target a animation by number. I really like using animation by name. And whatever's typed in here is what we can call it from in the system. So jump arrow will be that. Apply. And now we have our amazing little jump arrow. We are also actually going to need to pair an arrow to make sure that we make an arrow for every player, so that they have their own control over their player. We need to add some synchronicity across the game, which means we need to add another multiplayer behavior to make sure that this is synchronized for all the players. Kind of see where players are jumping around to, and we want to make sure that there is one for everyone. We also need to add another behavior, and it's called tween. Tweens allow us to smoothly move and animate an object without needing to actually use rigging and things like this. This is great for sliding things around and changing the scale and tons of other properties. So we're going to add the tween. To be able to use it in the event sheet, we must add it to an object. So if you can't find tweens, it's because it's not added to as a behavior that you can use yet. And this is how you do that. We're going to hit OK. And now we're going to move over into our actual events and start from the very beginning on creating the movement and interaction with our character. Now, this is where things start getting a little bit more complicated, because as we're working through all of this, it's going to require some multiplayer logic understanding, and I'll do my best to break it down to you kind of step by step, but there's going to be a lot of calls that most of you probably are unfamiliar with. But that's all right. So I think that it's in our best interest to create a spawn point for our player object, a location in our game world that we can create our player on, or every player on, as we get started here. So to do that, we're just going to add a new sprite object to our game. We're going to hit sprite. We're going to call this spawn point. And we're going to create it with Piskel. we're going to go into our primary colors and select something in the purple region because good old Gdevelop. And I'm going to make sure I resize this to 32 by 32 and paste it in here. We're going to call this spawn point, and we're going to hit save. Henry, I appreciate that. Thank you. I try. If you've got any questions along the way, do ask, please. Please do ask. All right. For convenience sake, we're going to start adding some folders here to organize our project. And we're going to call this invisible objects. And we're going to put spawn point inside of that folder. We can move it around if we want and reorganize. So now we have invisible objects, and we'll be adding a few more of those here in a minute. But we're going to start with just adding that one point in. Now, if we added this point to our game scene, we can now use this object as a object to spawn other things on, right? Pretty straightforward. Well, since we're going to be adding our players to the base layer of our game, we don't want to change its location. And for the simplicity of showing you how to build some collision boxes for a 2D object that is physics-based, there we go. I was thinking of the words to say. We're going to be creating our first wall object. All right. And so you might think it's a sprite or a tiled sprite, but actually we're going to be using the 9 patch system. You've probably never used this before, but the 9 patch or 9 panel sprite takes a sprite and chops it up into well, actually, no, we're going to use it. Never mind. Forgive me. We're not using a 9 panel sprite. I have used 9 panel sprites for this before, but I think in the tile, let me go look real fast. Hold on. Okay. So the way that a 9 panel sprite is developed is it chops it up into effectively 9 pieces like a tile set would be, and then allows you to configure those and stretch them in different ways, and you can make padding zones so that the edges are smaller than the middle, and it allows a lot more flexibility. But what's really cool about 9 panel sprites is you can also use them in a tiled sprite. It works a little bit differently, except for it stretches everything evenly. So we're going to be using a 9 patch sprite in a tiled sprite. So that's where my brain got a little confused. We need to choose a file. We're going to choose it from our device, and we're going to type wall. Or in this case, it's 9 patch castle. And we want the first one not big. I'm going to copy that. And we're going to set it to, instead of 32 by 32, we're going to set it to 48 by 48. When we hit apply and we add our walls in, even though it's a 9 panel sprite, right, we have this option. I'm so sorry. I choked there for a second. My throat is very dry. Let me get to William here. Is it good enough for newbies? I mean, can we make any kind of 2D game we want, even if we're noobs? Yeah, William, absolutely. The Gdevelop is a no-code system, or at least that's how it's described. That's a little misleading in terms of, if you want to make a very simple project, it doesn't really require any lines of event sheets, and it definitely doesn't require any actual programming using written script languages. And so in that way, it is very user-friendly. And if you follow along, especially after I edit this into a short form video series, you'll definitely be able to learn everything you need to be able to start making some pretty fun games. Okay, so now that we've added our repeating texture of that 9 patch. So what's pretty cool is we could use a 9 patch, chop it up right here on the lines, and it would make it so it's like infinite. So we could stretch it any way we wanted, and we can make it look like a inventory background or something like that. But in this particular case, we're just using it as a repeatable tile. So we're going to stretch it all the way over for now, all the way across, just to make this a little convenient for us. And we're going to go double click on the object, go back into the behaviors. And because we're using a physics 2D object, we have to, for our player, we also have to add some physics behaviors to this object. So we're going to not use tweens. We're going to go to physics. We have to add the physics engine 2D here. And this will allow us to just have a static object. So this is something that doesn't move. It can sleep, meaning basically it's just resting. It isn't going to bounce around or really react to anything that is physical. So any other physics object will just kind of bounce right off of it. In terms of all the settings, we can add some friction. And we're going to use this as a mask layer for every single layer. So we have a topical layer, and then we have a masking layer. There's a lot. The best way to kind of describe this, I'm trying to think. This is basically pushing it across all of the different layers in terms of like how it interacts with objects. So in this case, because it's static, we can use its mesh across all of the different layers basically as a collision point. And if we were to add this to other layers, it kind of overlaps. It wouldn't be able to overlap an item. So in physics, if it's on the same layer, it won't allow two objects to occupy the same space. And masks effectively apply the same logic from one layer across multiple. And when you're using it in terms of like, in this case, yeah, I mean, that's the best I got for you. Anyways, so now when we press preview, we have a rigid body that stands in place, and we have a spawn point. Well, that doesn't really do us any good. If I was to add our player object, we'd see them fall and bounce. Hello? Oh, it's because he's not technically on layer 1. Okay, so there we have the layer 1. So masking would allow it to basically occupy... We're going to use a cheat code here. We're going to hit Control P to open this up. And mask. Toggle mask. We want, just to make sure I'm explaining this right, we want the engine information. Okay, I wasn't wrong. So the layer is the logical group that an object can belong to. Objects can be a member of multiple layers. And the mask is a list of layers that an object will collide with. So, yeah, I was on point. What this will basically, let me try to think. I'm trying to see where I want to take you guys on this thought journey. There's so much to digest in this template. I want to make sure that we do it appropriately, and I get all the information in there, because we're gonna have to chop these down into shorter videos for people who don't like watching the live streams and want precise information. So a lot of this stuff right here we're gonna cut out, and and we'll go directly into adding wall sourcing here in a little while, like building our actual game scene. But I want to make sure that you guys are watching or getting the most information you can right now, to make sure that I address all the questions that are going to arise from people who haven't seen the other videos or don't understand exactly what I'm doing right now. In terms of like where everything is in Gdevelop. Anyways, mumbling aside, let's get back to work here. We're at the beginning. I mean, everything you start inside of a project kind of begins at one singular place, at least a lot of the time for me. And that's at the beginning Um, oh, hold on one second. Whoa. And that's at the beginning of the scene. And at the beginning of the scene, I want to hide the spawn point. We don't need to see it in our game, right? We don't want to see that. We want to hide that. And then what we want to do is start deciding whether or not, start creating our player objects. So at the beginning of the scene, we're going to start with the host and we're going to create one object. So every time a player loads into the scene, effectively, you are kind of like your own host in a way. And what we're going to be doing is when we load the scene, because when we join from the lobby, it's going to load our game scene in, and we need it to create our player automatically. So we're going to hit Shift and D to create a child, and I'm going to hit Shift and C to create a comment. And we're going to say, let each player create their multiplayer objects, and then to be synced with other players. All right. So we're going to write out what our intention is, and then we're going to design it. So the first thing that we want to do when we load into the game scene per player is create our objects. We're going to action. So this doesn't require any conditions because the at the beginning of the scene is already our condition. This will only load once. We're going to create a object, and the object that we want to create is player object. Had I clicked on player object first, it would be trying to create an object from the player object's location rather than creating an object, inserting the object, and then telling it what location to go to. We're going to set it to the object that we created called spawn point, and then we're going to add the X and Y location. So it's going to find where that box is, and it's going to create a player on that location. We want to make sure that we develop our player on the base layer. The base layer is the general area where we're interacting with all of our game stuff. We'll have a UI layer later, and we'll have another layer for the background as well. But base layer is where we want to start. So now that we've created that on the base layer, we want to take ownership in multiplayer. So we go into action, take ownership. And we're going to not take ownership of a variable, but we're going to take ownership of an object. And the object that we want to take control of is our player object. And if you haven't added the multiplayer behavior to the player object, you won't be able to do this. And it says take the ownership of the object. It will be then synchronized to the other players with the current player as the owner. And as you're loading into Gdevelop, because we already know that you are an independent player through the lobby, it connects your username from your Gdevelop account and your profile basically into the player object automatically. So all we have to say is that, take ownership of that. However, we want, before we start enabling and moving things around, because of how many players there are going to be, there's going to be a lot of cameras. We need to make sure that we actually disable something on our project, and it's something called synchronization. Sorry, and we want to synchronize. So sync. And I want to make sure I click on the right one here. I am going the wrong way. Because it's from the player object, we have to do it from the player object. We added a multiplayer plugin, so we click on the player now, and then we type sync. And we want to enable or disable the synchronization of a behavior. Because every object of the player has a smooth camera, the game wouldn't know. It would apply. Whoever the latest player is would then take control of all of the cameras, and we don't want that. So we're going to disable synchronization. We don't need to share our camera data with the other players. We don't need to do that. Now what we want to do is make sure that every player, once they're created, so I'm going to copy and paste the comment, move it down one, or again, Control C. And we want to, we enable a specific physics layer for each player so that they are in collision with objects, but not with each other. So this is going to allow us, because we're using physics objects, this would be a little bit different if we weren't using physics objects, but because we are, we need to assign each player their own location. So this is a little limited because it only allows us up to the maximum number of players that there are layers inside of the physics engine. And I don't know if you can extend beyond that point. I haven't tested it because the lobbies aren't that big. I haven't been able to get 16 people into one lobby yet to test to see if we can break it. So instead, what we're going to do here is we're going to keep it within the parameters of how many objects there are currently, like how many current players there are within the limited capacity of our player lobby. And we can use multiplayer functions, or expressions rather, to access this data and incrementally increase it based on the number of players. So here's what we do. We go to our player object and we type enable, and we're looking for the enable layer. Now, if I was to not click on this, I could scroll down and eventually I'll find all the physics stuff, and you can find the filtering enable layer. And just like we were talking about before, we need to assign something here. Now here, we can write in 1 through 16, as that's how many layers there are. But there's this little button over here that's called an expression. It changes it to an expression. It allows us to write more things. You actually don't have to click it. You can just start typing because Gdevelop automatically knows what expressions are. But we can type an expression called multi. So we start with multiplayer. So this is all of the expressions that use the multiplayer expression, the multiplayer extensions expression list. There we go. And we can look at currently, like, what our current player number is, or what the current player ping is, the last player joined, the last player who left, and so on. And we can send messages and change a bunch of different variables. But what we're currently looking for is the very first one, which is current player number. So because of the lobby, the host is effectively host or player 1, and then the next person is player 2, and so on. So if we type current player number, it'll take 0, which is the host, plus 1, because 0 isn't a layer option. So we need to add 1 to be player 1 so that we can add ourselves to that layer. And we're going to say enable yes. So now for each one who comes in, we're going to get your current number in the player lobby. We're going to add 1, and we're assigning that layer to you. So that way you don't bounce off of another player. If you want player bouncing, then you can add them all to the same layer, and it would be total and epic chaos. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add another event here, and it's not a child. It needs to be just at the same, programming elevation, if you will, the same order, right? No, we don't need anything tabbed in here. And this also, again, because nothing in here requires a trigger once, it'll automatically do it once. We can just focus on our actions. Because these are, in this one in particular, doesn't need a trigger action. There's no variable dependent on us before this happens, except for at the beginning of the scene. Just like the player, what we want to do is then create a indicator arrow for the player. So we're going to type create. We're going to create an object, and we're going to do indicator. Now we're going to create that indicator at the spawn point, just like we do with the player. at the XY spawn coordinate of the player. Perfect. And we're going to make sure it's on the base layer, just like our player is. Then we're going to change the Z order, which allows this to basically show up behind the player. So Z order is depth in 2D. So if think of paper stacked on top of each other. The very first paper is 0. And if you put something behind that paper, it's -1. But if you put something in front of it, then it's 1. If you put another piece of paper in front of it, that new one is 2, and so forth. And so we can actually use Z order to position our sprites to make sure that they overlap properly in the right positions. We want our indicator under every circumstance to be behind the player in case there's some clipping of the sprite. So we're going to go to the indicator, and we're going to type Z for Z order. And we're going to set this to the variable of player object. And because you're assigned this player object, it's going to automatically assume that we're talking about you, the player that we just assigned and created for you. And we're going to take that player object and we're going to get its Z order position. So no matter if you're the 5th object created, because every time you add an instance to Gdevelop, it pluses 1 to the Z order automatically. So unless you define a Z order, they'll be added at different levels. So a player who's created later on will have the same Z order, or will have a later Z order, and potentially draw in front of the first player. Now, we want to just make sure that all of these indicators are always spawned behind the player. So we'll take the player object Z order -1. That's it. Just one page behind the player. And we want to then take ownership. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it down here. And then we're going to change it from ownership of the player to now we're going to take ownership of that indicator. And if you don't have this option or indicator arrow doesn't show up, it's because you forgot to add the behavior to the indicator, the multiplayer synchronization. And then at the end of all that, we're going to hide it. We only want it to be shown under certain conditions. So after it's created and positioned properly, go ahead and just move it out of the way. Later on, we're going to add another set of rules here to add in the logic for adding player names, but we're going to move over that for now. And we're going to start developing the foundation of our player controller. So now that we're out of at the beginning of the scene elements, we need to start working on kind of a little bit of organization here. So what I like to do is right click, create an event group, and start organizing this. And we'll change this into camera behaviors. There we go. Camera behaviors. And inside of that just for organization, we're going to start off by creating a comment and defining what we're going to be doing. We're going to, for other players, existing or new, right? For anybody who's joining or may already exist, ensure that the camera behavior, are not activated so they don't affect our game. And this is important because, as I said before, we're disabling the camera and we're going to need to re-enable, we're disabling the synchronization of that object between everybody, but that doesn't change how ownership or how the engine reads the display factor, basically. So we need to target now each player object, which is assigned to a player, right? As we've defined up here. So to do that, we're gonna use a for each object. So for each instance of the object of player object, we're gonna check a few conditions. The first, immediately we need to check if we don't own the object. So we're gonna click on player. We're gonna type owner, like ownership, right? Click on that. And This is the one. Sorry, it is object owned by current player. We're checking, is the object owned by the player, and we're actually going to say isn't owned. This inverts it. We can click on it, press J to get the red arrows, and that means invert that. So say the opposite. So for each instance of player object, if the object of the player is not owned by the current player, or is owned otherwise from the current player. So this could be anybody else. Not is not, but really this is saying anybody else but you. And effectively, though, it in practice, it really is basically saying is not the current owner. So for each instance of the player object that's on your game screen that you don't own, we want to do something to. We want to make sure that there's no overlap with any of the behaviors. So we need to check to make sure that that smooth camera behavior, because it's automatically activated when we add it as a player behavior, we have to deactivate it, which means we have to go to our player and we're going to type there, behavior activated. There we go. So behavior activated. We're going to say if the smooth camera is activated, because it currently is for every single player object. For the ones that we don't own, even though there's no synchronicity, we need to say turn that off, because we don't want it to take control of our own camera. So now we're going to go in here, click on the player object. We're going to type activate this time, and it's D/activate a behavior. We're going to choose the behavior we want to deactivate, and so we're going to choose smooth camera, and we're going to say no. Don't activate this, i.e. shut it off. Turn that off. Perfect. So we have the fundamentals now for each player who joins the game. They take ownership of the object. We disable camera smoothing, so we're not sending that data back and forth to every player. We assign them on their own layer. We create an indicator for them, just like we did create each player, their own player. They now get their own indicator. They get to take ownership of it, and we hide it. And now for each of the player objects where we don't own them, we need to make sure that the smooth camera behavior isn't activated on our end. And that's what we do here. And that's the end of that code right there. So really, the next thing for us to do is because a big part of our game is the tilting back and forth of the arrow, so we can know where we're going to jump to in this rage game. So we need to now focus real quick on making that element function. So that all we have to do is create a new behavior. We're going to pull it out of the camera behaviors list, so everything now should just be in a nice little row. And we're starting on a fresh little spot. So we're going to hit Control C, Shift C, my bad, not Control. And we're going to type in what the next step is. So we move the arrow, and eventually it'll be and the player name. We haven't added that yet, so I'll put that in brackets to let me know that I need to do that for all players. All right, so we're going to move the arrow and the player name for all the players so that their movement, the movement of the arrow and the player name is smooth for everyone. And we have to start, because we're using, when we check multiple objects, instance object, and we're using expressions, if we want to target more than one of them, and we want them to independently run all this data, we must ask it to run for each instance. Oops. So for each, can we not select both of those? Hello? There we go. For each instance of this object, and the object currently is the player object, we need to check ownership as a condition. So we're going to say if the owner of this instance is equal to you, the current player. So that we're going to check indicator arrow. We're going to check the player. And this is where we're not going to be checking if the current player owns it. Instead, we're going to be checking in a more global sense. We're going to be checking an equation. So this is the if the player object, or sorry, not the player object, if the indicator arrow from the player who owns it is equal to the actual player. So we're just going to validate that that's true. And we start that by typing the player object, and then we type dot multiplayer object. As we can see here, we can press enter on it. And then we're going to be passing in one return data. And this is the return the player owning the object. Oh, perfect. So basically we're saying if the player object is owned correctly by the current player, you, then, or each of them in this case, because this is going to be for every instance of player. So for every instance of player, we check for every instance of indicator that they own specifically, and then we change its position to the player object that is in control of it. So that's pretty straightforward. We go to indicator, we type position to change its X and Y position, and we're going to now change it to the player object and not layer. I don't know why I jumped to that. We're going to do player object X and player object Y. Now, because we're using the center, this automatically uses the origin of our player. And earlier I said that I would prefer to put the origin at my feet. But in this particular case, we left it on the eye, which is exactly where it was in the template. And the reason is now because of where we're positioning this, the indicator will be created basically off that point going upwards. And so now we can then take those positions and do fun things with them. So now that we have it, every player basically takes the ownership and it positions it exactly where it should be. So if I was to create my lobby, I'm not going to show you what we've done so far. We're going to launch our game. Let me launch it from here. Okay, join the lobby. It's just me, so there's no other players to worry about. Hit ready up. It's going to load us into our game scene. If everything worked right, it'll create our player. And now, that's it. And the indicator has been created, but you can't see it. There's a cool little trick in Gdevelop for those who are new to it that may be interested in this. I want to show you at the beginning of the scene. We're going to delete this here in a minute, but I want to show you a cool little trick that we can do. If we type hitboxes or just hit, we can see the action draw collision hitboxes and points. We'll leave that as it is. And we want to show collision for hidden objects. Say yes. We can turn off point names for now. Well, we'll leave those on actually, just so you can see. If I launch this preview, it'll load me right into the game so I don't have to go through the lobby system. But here we can actually see here's the position in the center of the invisible creation block. Here's all of that data that we created underneath our player, ground check 1 and 2, as well as where the pointer currently is. We see here that the indicator arrow got spawned this way, because again, the top of it is created it starts at the origin point, which is the top left, and is created downwards. And so here we have our little design. And what's really nice about this is we can customize it and turn off other things. So we can turn off the points so we can see better. Go ahead and hit OK and preview again. And now we can see the collision of the different objects that we have. Pretty cool. This allows us to be able to tinker in our game and see where maybe something isn't quite lining up, or making sure that our hitboxes are right for maybe attack animations and all sorts of cool stuff. So that's not in the actual template, but I wanted to show you that because it might become valuable to you. And like, yeah, I lost that object. Where is it? You can make sure that it's being synced with the player, making sure it's moving around correctly if you enable that feature. Woo! All right. Now, we're going to start with the player-specific controls. Okay, so I'm going to create a new event group, and we're going to call this player controls. basically what we have to do, okay, is create an event. And I'm kind of gonna stage this a little bit differently so that way it matches the template a little bit more. I'm gonna create a new comment section, and we're gonna do player specific events, basically are below here. And we're gonna say if the arrow and button press and the movement of the player is only handled by the current player. My bad. I don't know if it's just the. There we go. The arrow and button press. So we're talking about what we're gonna be adding a button press for our player to be able to move around. So the quotes button press, just to make sure that I remind myself that I need to keep building it. And the movement of the player is only handled by the current player. We've kind of pre-established some of that, but you can check those conditions easily by using the multiplayer extension and simply click on each object you want and just check if it is owned. This is where we're going back to validate that it is owned. Is it owned by the current player? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Okay. So we're going to do that with the player object and the indicator. Later on, when we add the player name in polish stage, we'll add that here too. So if you own these, is the only time you should be able to control this. And now we want to start our controller. Now, this is pretty interesting, the way that they set it up in the template, and I understand why. For the style of game, it makes perfect sense. So we're going to be checking if a tween exists. So in this game, I'm going to show you the actual level again. So this is what we're going to be creating. So the indicator arrow needs to move back and forth, and then we need to hold space and send our player using the force mechanics wherever we want to go, right? So and that's the only way we can move in this game currently. All right, well, I mean, at all in the template. So that's what we want to do. And the way that they start doing that is before, if you remember, we had our player, or not our player, my apologies, the indicator arrow have a tween behavior added to it. So tweens can, we want to be checking if the object is currently started. Like, is there a tween happening? Hey, what's up, Bo? Is there a tween happening, or is there, does something, is it currently moving at all? And so we're going to check for a current tween in progress. And we're going to just name it prepare, which just means we're just using it as an identifier, right? So if the tween exists, and I didn't mean to be progress, I meant to click exist. So if the tween exists for prepare, well, it's not going to, because we haven't defined prepare yet. So we're actually going to invert this and say, basically, this is our preparation step. If the tween for this arrow doesn't exist, then we want to start showing it. We want to start the process. So we use this tween behavior as a trigger to kind of start the behavior. You could use a Boolean and other factors, but unless we use prepare in another state, it's just kind of like a trigger for free, So if it doesn't exist, which it prepare currently won't, we need to start the control behavior. And now we are going to be adding prepare as a tween later on in the controller. So right now, though, it starts as a basic preparation. All of this is based on tweening, and that's why we're using a tween rather than a bool or something. But because the tween actually has a purpose, we can just use the tween instead of a variable, effectively. So this is substituting a variable at the start, and then it triggers into a on and off sort of switch. So at the start, when tween prepare doesn't exist, we need to start telling the engine what to do under these circumstances. So at the very beginning, when we own the object, what do we want it to do? So we're going to be checking if the player now, underneath this step, let me add a Shift-C for a comment. We're going to say initially showing the arrow when the player comes to a stop. So we're going to check if the prepared tween, the prepared tween isn't started, which is going to be the holding space and launching our character off. So if that sequence hasn't started, then we're checking to see if the player is moving, right? So we only want this to show up if the player isn't moving. So the best way to do that is to use the physics engine, because we have a physics object, and we're going to be checking the player's physics, or the player you own's physics, and we're going to be checking the velocity. And we're going to be looking for the, I want to say it's linear velocity. There we go. So we're going to be using the linear velocity of our 2D object, and we're going to be checking if it is 0. So if we're not moving at all. Hey, what's going on, Abu? So if our player object is not moving at all, and the indicator, so we're not really going to add and, but I'm saying and as in add this as well. So if this and this next step, right? If the indicator, and we're going to type visible, so it only has visibility here. So if it is visible, well, it's not visible right now because we hit it. We're going to invert this. So if it's not visible, so if we're not moving and it's currently invisible, and we're going to check 2 more tweens. We're going to be checking, I'm going to paste this in, and we're going to change the identifiers as left and as right. Because we have a process where we're going to move our arrow left and right. So what this is saying is when we're not moving and the indicator arrow isn't visible and left isn't playing or existing and right isn't playing or existing, we're going to trigger this one time to enter a state, basically. We're going to trigger this so that now everything underneath it only fires once. And we're going to be taking in the action list, right? We're going to start by showing the indicator. So when it's invisible, we want it to show instead. So this will trigger. And we want to toggle we're going to use a Boolean to be able to decide which direction, left and right, for our arrow to start moving. And there's a very easy way to do this using a Boolean. There's a toggle value, which rather than setting it to true or false, it will, when it reaches the endpoint, toggle it from one to another without, if you do write it as Boolean true, Boolean false, when you do that trigger, it'll happen like sort of instantly, and it'll snap you back in an infinite loop back and forth. But toggle works like a double-sided light switch, if you will, one of those rocker switches. And so we're going to go to our player object, and we're going to add a variable, and we're going to add that and change it to Boolean, which is a true or false statement. And we're going to name it direction randomizer. All it's we're going to start it like starting this behavior off effectively. So we'll leave it as false in its default state. It doesn't need to be enabled yet. So we're going to set it to false. So if direction randomizer is false, all right, we've got that pre-built in. So we're going to now check the action. Oops. Did I close it? Okay, good. No. All right, the stream's still going. Holy cow. I thought I just closed the stream for a second. I was about to screech. Okay, sorry about that. So what we want to do now is trigger this one time. So every time we stop moving, show the indicator and then randomly like toggle it, rock it back and forth between which direction to start from, left or right, right? And when we toggle it on and off, later on in our script, it'll keep going so that it's consistent throughout everything. So we're just going to check the player, and we're going to type variable. So if the player's variable of randomizer, and instead of setting it true or false, we're just going to toggle it. So there we go. So now we're going to rock that switch. And now we need to ask it underneath this condition. So when this rings true, we now need to check variables for the randomizer. And it needs to only happen once every time it rotates. So basically, we need to add in the player variable, we're checking whether or not it's true or false. So we'll start it at true and then copy paste and set it to false. So now we have two other conditions that are firing. If the randomizer direction is true, we're going to change the indicator and we're going to change its angle. And we're going to change the angle of its position, if true, to 15. We're going to start it at 15 or 16. Yeah, no, it should be 15. 15. And then we're going to now tween to a different position. So we're going to start at one position, and then we're going to enable a tween, which makes us move all the way to another position. And then we're going to do it the opposite direction. So here it goes. Now that we have the angle set, we now need to set the next angle, which is our tween angle. So object tween, and we're looking for tween object angle. If the identifier is left, okay, so from true, we're going to go left. We're going to angle this in degrees to 165, angle, 165 degrees, linear, over 1.5 seconds. We're going to copy this, paste it into here, and then we're going to write it in reverse. Now, we're going to say we're going to start at angle 165, and then we want to move back to angle 15. And that should be the right direction. So now we have right and left. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I wrote this backwards. This is left. I think we're false. Wait, no, let me make sure. No. True. Okay, so let me think about this in my head. If the variable of randomizer is true, we go to angle 15, and then we tween over to 165. That would be left. Okay, yeah. And then from 165 to right, that would be right. Perfect. So that's going to happen, right? However, that's only telling it to tween in this direction, and it's setting the tween, the current in progress tween, to left. And then it's setting the current progress tween to right. But it's not, nothing's deleting it or stopping it. It's just gonna endlessly go. And so they're not really gonna move at all. It's gonna get stuck. So what we need to do, now that we're showing the arrow when the player comes to stop, right? We need to add another comment. I'm just gonna duplicate for my own sanity. And we're gonna say, setting the arrow to go the opposite direction when the tween ends. So in the logic flow of what we're doing, I know there's a lot going on here, but we have to pull it out because this is only this is happening once. It happens every time you stand still, and it picks one and it starts the process. Now we need to actually cause it and enforce that to happen. So what we're going to do is move the condition underneath the comment. It needs to be underneath this tween because it's all logic that happens here, right? So now we need to check if the left tween is happening. We're going to turn this on. So if the tween to the left on the air indicator, and now instead of is existing, we want to check if it's finished, because we want it to wait until it's all the way done and then do something else. So once left is done, we need to remove it so that it doesn't continuously fire, right? Because we're deleting it from the history, like temporarily removing it. So we're going to go back to the indicator and we're going to remove a tween, and we're going to remove the left tween. So we start on the left, and now we need to repeat the same information that we did down here, but back to this point. But here we're doing it in reverse. So if left indicator has finished playing, remove left from the indicator. Now start the right direction. So this one here, the one that we do one time, begins the situation, like begins the toggle. And then this continues to make sure it's doing its job. This will only happen the once. It'll go once, and then it'll start the whole process because it starts creating those on the fly because they don't exist yet. They don't exist. No one's created them. Now they are created. Now we need logic for when they are created. You have to think about development as sort of a when this scenario is happening and when the scenario isn't happening, and knowing how to structure the code comes with practice. A lot of practice. So if you don't get this right away, don't stress it. You will in time. Don't stress it. So now what we're going to do, right, is take the right indicator and move it here. Because we're starting here on left. If left is true, stop left, go right. Perfect. We're going to duplicate this, and we're going to change the tween to right instead. Perfect. We're just going to rewrite everything and replacing left with right. And instead of this angle, we can go up here and grab this one and paste it down here. So this is the one from true. We're taking the 165 linear to the left. So now we have a toggle. Left, right, left, right. Let's see if that works. Here we are. And now we've got a left and right moving arrow. Now, the arrow's off center. It's being printed on our player, but because of its starting location using the points on the object. So if you have that problem, you go to your indicator arrow, go to edit your point, and move the origin down to the center position, exactly where the center is. Hit close and apply. Let's preview again. And there we have it. We have a nice little indicator. Back and forth, right? Perfect. It's kind of hard to see, so we're going to, at the beginning of our game scene, at the very top, I'm going to add in a action to zoom in the camera on the base layer. We don't need to zoom it centered on the player because that would overwrite the usefulness of the smooth camera object. Instead, we're just going to change the zoom of our camera, and we're just going to zoom in twice so we can see it just a little bit better. The smooth camera will cause us to automatically follow our player, so here we go. Now, we have our indicator going back and forth, and our player ready to move. Wow, we've done a lot of programming so far. Now, I want to make sure that we're going to allow our player to move before the end of this particular episode. So let's get down to that coding right now. Because as it stands currently, if I was to launch this in multiple windows, if I was logged in online and like connecting this way, I would have multiple player objects ready for me to use. If I had a friend that wanted to join me right now, they could join me. But we need to add the player movement. And we're going to be creating that by simply starting with a new event sheet. So Shift A to make it another adult is what I think of child, because there's child nodes, and then this is the adult node or the parent node. So Shift A for adult, right? So Shift A for adult. And now that we have a condition, we need to start checking if actually, hold on. We're going to check to see if the tween does exist. So we're going to copy and paste the prepared tween, and then we're going to invert it with J. So we're going to turn it back to regular. Let me just click save here. So there's that, right? And we're going to start programming from that point. And we're going to be checking whether or not the jump button has been released, and also setting the jump button now. So basically what we're going to be doing, just to make sure that this makes sense before I finish the program, is jumping when the button is released. And we don't have the jump button yet, which would need to be inside of this stage first of the player development. So right here at the bottom of this one, we're going to start the prepare feature. So I've kind of preemptively wrote the is false, is true sort of statement, right? So if prepare exists, or in this case, if prepare doesn't exist, and this is if prepare does exist. Well, I need to in the prepare, the whole point is to then actually release our button format as we move through our tweens. And we want the arrow indicator to stop and a bunch of other stuff. So we need to start by checking to make sure that we can, that we actually can press the space button to start. How do we do that? So this is a code challenge for you. I'm going to do it here in a moment, but this is a code challenge for you. This is a great part to stop, and I want you to go ahead and check. First of all, we need to see if the indicator arrow is visible, because here we started with it invisible and we set it to visible, which means now this basically turns off because the indicator is now visible. Because the requirement for us to do this particular task requires it to be invisible. So I need you to check to see if it is visible and if the space key is being pressed, because we're going to use the space key as our launching key. And then once you created that condition that the space key is being pressed and the indicator arrow is visible, we want to remove the left and right tweens from the indicator arrow. And we want to scale the arrow up using a tween to 2 times its normal size over 1 second. And that tween is going to be called prepare. So that's your instructions. Now I'm going to show you how to do it. So for those who are interested in doing this challenge, you could pause and not spoil here or turn down the audio. But those that are going to be watching later on, this will be cut as a challenge for the end of one of my shortcut videos. So now I'm going to show you how to do it. We're going to add the condition. We're going to start with the key pressed, okay? And when we press this key, we're going to start the whole process. So when the key is pressed, it's sort of like transferring between state machines, but we're using, again, tweens to manage our state. So here, we're going to be checking if the space key, so you're going to hold, make sure you have a capital S so that you can select the space or the space bar. And then we need to check if it's visible. And you can just copy this down and then click on it and press J. So if the indicator arrow is visible and the space key is pressed. Later on, we're going to make this mobile friendly too, so we'll have to add a little bit more programming here, but we'll come back to that when we do. Now, I want you to remove the left and right. We can copy these by holding, if we hold Shift and click on another one, we can copy them both and hit Control C. We can paste the action, and we're going to remove the left and right tweens from happening. We're going to stop that from happening. I'm going to create a comment down here just so we can make sure beginning the charge for jump, right? So to begin the charge, we're going to press the space key as long as the arrow is visible. We're going to remove the left and right tween so it stops bouncing left and right. So it's going to stick to its current angle. And then we're going to click on indicator arrow. We're going to do another tween, and it's tween scale. And this is going to increase an object size based on its the default X width and height that you created it to. So we're going to scale it to ×2, and we're going to do it over 1 second. And we're going to scale the object from the center. We don't need to destroy this object when it finishes. We don't want that to happen. That'll get rid of our arrow. And there it is. So we're going to hit apply. And now if I was to hit space, it would get really big. And that's all that happens. Because now prepare does exist. So it's waiting for us to, as we're holding the space key, because key is pressed, that means it's still down. When we release the key, right, then it switches us. We're no longer pressed. So as we hold it down, remove the tweens and start scaling this up from the center over 1 second until it reaches its maximum. And now the prepare does exist. So we move on to the next step. And that's the jump when the button is released. So now we can finally condense this. Oops, let's just condense it down, make it nice and readable, make it as small, as organized as possible. Now that we checked if the preparer exists, we also should just double check that the indicator arrow is still visible. So I'm just going to open that up and paste it into here, so I don't have to keep retyping it. Just to save myself some time. But if you need the help, it's just go to indicator arrow, visible, and there it is. Now we have to look for a okay. So this gets a little complicated. I'm going to try to do my best to explain this to you guys step by step, but we're going to do a little bit of writing here. We're going to start with the default, like the first thing that we want to check is, well, I guess really first of all, we're going to pick all of the indicator objects. So we're going to indicator object, pick them all. So when the scene exists, because this is being done basically for everyone. So when the object reports that this is happening, they're going to be seeing like bouncing left and right arrows and all of that. So we're going to pick all of them when they enter the state, just to make sure that when anybody enters the state, it makes sure that all of the objects do it. Like whenever it pops up for an object. So pick them all. And then we want to check we're going to start with OR. And really what OR is saying is check if one of these conditions underneath it is true. And so we're going to pick all of them. And then we're going to, oh my goodness. My throat is so sore today. Hello? Oh, we're going to, after we check all of them, we're going to wait until the tween is finished. So no matter what, like it's going to take a second to grow big, but over 1 second, you know, right? As you're holding the space bar down. But once that is locked into place and you've released it and it is grown effectively to size, we need to make sure that it's done being played. So we're going to add a subcondition and we're going to check if the indicator, and we're going to check to make sure that the tween is finished playing. And the tween is prepare. So if we're going to pick them all, and we're actually going to move this on the bottom. So if the tween prepare has finished, and then we're going to look for a and is the next thing we're going to do. And it's actually an and statement. And check if all of the subconditions are true. So now, if this is done and all of this condition is met, then move on to the next step. And in this particular case, because we will be adding mobile support here in a little, like on another episode, we're going to be checking if mobile is supported and also what keys are being pressed. So for right now, we can just add a subcondition of the key being pressed, and the key is spacebar, right? That's the jump key. So we're going to, if the tween is done and not pressed, sorry, it needs to be released. So if this is true, we finally tweened all of it and it's finally to maximum size, and we released the key, pick all of the instances of the arrow object in that state and check if the object of that particular indicator that's shooting off this message is owned by you. So if the object of indicator arrow, and we're going to say is owned, right, is owned by the current player. So if you own it, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to apply force, and we're going to use the scaling factor of our arrow to decide the force. And that's why we're scaling it up while I'm holding it. So it's just going to gradually get times two bigger over 1 second until I release the arrow. And it's going to use all that force to send my player to the space station. Okay? And so what we have to do is go to the action on this. And now we're going to start applying the impulse to the player. So this is going to add the impulse is pressure to the player. We're moving them at using the physics engine, we're moving them. So we're going to click on the player and hit apply, and we're going to apply impulse. So impulse is like thrust, and then force is like continuous, impulse is like an immediate push, right? And we need to actually use the impulse angle at this case. There is some math going on here that you don't really need. It'll be okay. We'll work through this. So we're going to use the indicator arrow dot angle, and we're going to add 180 to it. And the reason is because as we're moving, right, the position that we originally had it in, the sprite position, it needs to be rotated so that way we can get that full spectrum effectively. So we're going to apply the current angle plus 180 degrees to offset it properly. And we're going to apply a length. And this is where things get interesting. The point of this is indicator arrow. Okay. So length, indicator arrow, scale. Now we're going to pass through the current value of that scale. It's called value. Okay. So this is what the written expression looks like. Indicator arrow dot what we're doing, scale. And there's a lot of autofill here going on. So you don't have to remember all of this. But we're taking the value that is inside of scale. So if I went back to our player and we set it at, scale at ×2 perpetually, rather than increasing it ×2 slowly, it's going to keep returning whatever value is inside of there. That's a pretty handy thing because you can also get, when you use like input text, like when you type, you enter the value of that typed field into like the chat box. And that's how we know how to send messages and what messages to send. And so we're going to indicate the value. So at this time, it's a whatever the current scale is. And then we're going to multiply it by its same value. So we're taking the default scale and we're multiplying it by effectively the current scale, right? And then we're passing through a division of 6. And that's just deciding the total length of the thrust that we can apply. And it divided by 6. I mean, you could change it and change the force mechanics, but this is just something that allows us to regulate that movement a little bit more, so it's not so intense. Okay. And then we're going to start that from the player object, center, X, center Y. And because the center is the same as the origin point, it just works out. We're launching this player from the middle of their body. We're shooting them off from the origin point. And then once we let go of that, so that's all the math you need there. Once we let go of that, we need to immediately, right, hide the arrow, because we want the arrow to hide while we're flying through the air. I don't want to see it while I'm flying through the air, right? And then we want to remove the tween. Okay, so because the tween is currently existing, we now need to remove the tween. We want this whole process to start over again, so we have a full circle in our code, and we're almost there. And once the full circle is done, we'll stop this video today for this one, and we'll dive more into it over the next few live streams over this week. And so I'll do another one on Wednesday and one on Friday. And by the end, we'll have everything you need to be able to fully make this template by yourself. I don't want to over digest some of this stuff, and I want to make sure that you have time to pace yourself. So here we are. We're going to click on indicator arrow. And actually, I think we just did hide, didn't we? We need to now go to tween, and we need to remove the tween of prepare. There we are. So remove the tween of prepare, and we want to change the scale factor of our arrow back to where we started. So we can just go to scale and set the scale back to 1. We don't need to tween it back to 1 because it's already invisible. The player isn't going to see it snap back to its original size. So that's it. So now, if I hit apply, we have this rotating point. If I hold it down and let go, we now have our jump mechanic. And now we have full circle jump mechanics. Look at this. Whee! And that's it. Congratulations. You've made a huge step forward in making multiplayer games today. We started with loading the lobby, getting players into the game and assigning players per player, as well as giving the player the ability to move and to be controlled. So hopefully you found this helpful, and I'm looking forward to working on this project and making sure that we digest this all the way for everyone. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, happy game making. I can't wait to see you in the next video.